Okay, talking pretty and deeply debating. Basically, we spend 9 months talking about what you say in debating, and all there is in debating is what you say and how you say it. So now we're going to talk about how you say it. This is what I think most people, their journey in debating, which is that you start by just being like, I'm more persuasive than everyone else, and then you have thoughts about all the other things that you have to do, and then none of them really matter. They're all kind of fake. And so eventually you just realize that you have to convince them, that ultimately you're just more persuasive, and people only use the other stuff, this is my really controversial opinion, when they're trying to give a reason about why they kind of already know that you win or you lose. As in they already are convinced or they're unconvinced, and only very rarely do other random things in the judge manual actually influence how the debates turn out. Mostly, you just have to convince them. So how do you convince them? I've made 3 really arbitrary distinctions between the different parts of how you say it as it were. The first is the execution bit. This is the bit that actually matters and changes things. The other 2 don't really matter. But the first one is on execution, which is how you get an idea that you have in prep time, and then you get it credited as material that you say in your speech. It's particularly useful for firsts, but also probably matters for seconds, because usually the difference between prep time is more important there. Then the style piece of it, which is the passive way you talk about things, the delivery methods, stuff like that. And then lastly, on rhetoric, it's like the fun stuff, the dark arts of debating, the actual tools that you use to try to get better at the rhetoric piece of it. So when you do silly things like start speeches with Latin quotes or other stuff like that, where you're trying to get an explicit rhetorical advantage. This is what judges say and judges don't mean. As in, you try to credit basing the content of the speech, but ultimately that's pretty impossible. Judges are pretty fallible. There are lots of other factors that influence how you actually take in content. So when you think about giving a speech, often you're thinking about precisely all the different bits of your speech that contribute to whether it should get credited in XYZ way. But judges listen to 8 speeches over an entire hour of debating. And so they credit some of those things, and they listen to all of those things, and they write down most of those things if they're really good, but actually whether they factor into clashes is much rarer. So you think that the way you say things doesn't influence things, but actually they do. And I think you probably know this, where you've heard a speech and you're like, that speech was from someone rappy, or like it sounded good, but I could say the exact same words in that speech as that person, and I would get 5 speaks less than they do. Which I think is actually pretty reasonable and happens a lot, and is probably your fault and not the judges. On execution then, basically you have an idea in prep time, how you present it. I think this is particularly true for people in like their first year of debating. It took me a while to try to figure out how to get an idea that was the exact same as everyone else's ideas, and actually make people like the idea in a way that's helpful. I've made 3 arbitrary distinctions here too. The first is on disaggregation, that you have lots of ideas that exist in your mind, and you have to get them out separately. So instead of doing them all together, you have to actually have them come out one at a time. It's particularly true for like arguments, stuff like that. And then on labeling, and on illustration. By the way, if you have any questions as we go through, just interrupt me. On the first 2 parts of this idea, disaggregation is the idea of having a series of thoughts in your head where you have an argument that comes to you fully formed in the first 15 seconds of prep time, and then using that to split it up into 3 different sub-reasons that are actually the same thing. As in you have an idea like, probably the existence of this narrative makes people feel better about themselves because they like the idea of pride, and you do something where you split up each of those individual ideas into 3 separate things, and then you label them as such. So you have 3 different ideas that are actually the same idea. That's important though, because when you separate them out, it makes the case look more resilient. And the idea of disaggregation then, I think the advantages of doing it this way are threefold. First, you feel more resilient in terms of your argument itself. As in, it just feels more proven when you can say, here are the 3 ways this happens, as opposed to a paragraph or a line of speech that actually ends up saying those 3 ways, but doesn't separate them out in the same way. So it just feels more easy to actually prove it in that way. The second thing is that, as a judge, it's much easier to track. If you think about disaggregating what the 3 different strands of an idea are, as opposed to just the overall headline of the idea, then those 3 things can get written down, as opposed to just separately. And then lastly, when there's an argument on the panel about a clash, it's much easier for a panelist to fight for you when they can see the thing that you've labeled as the difference. So you said specifically, under buy-in, a 3rd thing that the other panelists didn't track. If you have that written out and labeled as a 3rd disaggregated idea about how you get buy-in, as opposed to an overall headline about how you might, they're more able to argue on your behalf. So you win more clashes on the margins that way. The other notes on disaggregation then are, you shouldn't usually use more than 3. Sometimes you can go up to 4, But by the time you have like 7 mechanisms for the same idea, you're usually doing too many. I've come to this flaw like quite a lot. It was around in Amsterdam where the entire extension was just why the Mexican government didn't have the capacity to implement this specific policy on anti-drugs or anti-gang activity. And by the time you get to like the 6th and 7th mechanism, they probably aren't going to make the extension win or lose. Like they're unlikely to be difference makers. But if you made the first 3 mechanisms much stronger, those actually will influence the stuff. So try to maybe write out a list of 7 mechanisms, disaggregate them into 7, and then recombine them into 3. What was that question?
No.
Sweet. Then on labeling. What you should think about here is that for each of the different strands of your argument, what do you actually want the judge to write down physically on their paper? As in, what are the 3 words that summarize the entire thing here? I think labeling is helpful for each individual part of the argument you're making. As in, from the beginning, your extension itself should probably have a label if you're in back half. And then physically say, our extension is on XYZ type of thing. That's helpful because then if you can't find a way to easily put out what the label of the extension is, probably the extension is too complicated. As in, if it takes an entire paragraph of speaking out loud about what actually your extension is doing in the debate, that's a sign that maybe your extension is too complicated. If you can phrase it in 4 words or a single sentence, you're much more likely to be able to get that tracked. The other thing I have here is doing it first. Label what you're saying before you say it, as opposed to the other way around. This is helpful because then you can get the thing credited, as in they know what you're talking about before you talk about it. So if you say the extension is specifically on the capacity of the Mexican government to do this thing, then when you give all your explanations, it's clear that you're always talking about capacity and you're not fighting an incentive clash that maybe you would have been fighting at a different point in time. So if you label things first, then the judge already knows what you're trying to do, and so therefore they don't have to do the thing that they sometimes otherwise have to do, where they reverse engineer once they eventually figure out what you're talking about, and then look back through their notes and say, oh, this is the point they were trying to prove earlier. If you label it first, and you label it clearly, then they're much more able to track it. The other advantage of doing it this way is that in prep time, whenever I'm working with anyone, I do this thing where I'm like, okay, great, how do we disaggregate this into mechanisms? Like, how do we put it into debater speak in some ways? And that's helpful too, because sometimes you realize that what you think is one idea is actually like 4 ideas, and so disaggregation forces you to separate those things out. As in, maybe you thought that the reason that this happened was 1, but actually there's a 3-fold other thing that influences how you get there. So that's really useful in content generation, because sometimes the best cases are extraordinarily simple ideas that feel like they could be explained in 1 30-second speech, and probably they could, but when you make it that way, it's much, much, much stronger, because you can get the first 6 layers, but you can never get to the 7th, so you always end up being better on that. We'll have an example of doing this a little later, because I think it's helpful to have some practice. Next, though, is on the illustration thing. I have a bad way to do this, and I have a really good way to do this. The bad way is me, the good way is we're done. Like, sounds surprising, but it doesn't actually sound that surprising. The idea here is, once you have all of the mechanisms, or you have all of the strands of the argument, or you have an extension that's labeled, sometimes in order for the judge to believe them individually, they have to pass like a gut check idea, as in they just have to sort of make sense in the abstract. The example doesn't need to be real. It can be an entirely theoretical example that illustrates how you just about get there, but that's helpful for making sure that things that feel similar actually are different, and other stuff like that. The key thing here is to like think about your judge and really figure out whether they would buy it or not. I have here a really sad round from the end of last year that was like just deeply devastating. Eli and I are in opening opposition. The case is about banning of non-compete clauses. We don't like that. We're saying that non-compete clauses are actually great. The case that Eli and I run is roughly along the lines that non-compete clauses are really important because people in certain industries that use them as a way to protect the informational knowledge and the IP of those specific companies. So it's advantageous because it means that those people are more likely to get information earlier. As in, when you hire someone new, you can actually give them the information they need, they can therefore get paid more, lots of other stuff like that. But basically, the central proof that our case relies on is this idea that non-compete clauses protect information, because it means that you can't go work for another company and take all the information you had at your old job and bring it to your new job. Now, that would have been great, except in the end, the judge, who was a really good judge in a good room, was like, but like, does that ever happen? Like, what the hell does that look like? Like, literally, Cyrus, what are you talking about? And I think even just one example could have been really helpful of illustrating specifically the instance in which this comes up. So the example that Eli and I then workshopped afterwards was maybe you have a situation where you're talking about an investment firm, and you have some leader in that investment firm that's really into commodities in Northwest Africa. And there's a lot about specifically certain minerals there, and exactly the most efficient ways to extract that and things like that, like what those markets look like. That's really specialized knowledge. It can't be protected by IP or anything like that because it's just what an individual happens to know about a certain region. But non-compete clauses mean that you can't work in those specific sectors of the same industries for another investment firm. And so when non-compete clauses work, you can really easily let that person do those things and actually work the way they want to. But if non-compete clauses didn't work, then that exact person who works in commodities in that one specific region could use that knowledge to get another better advantage for another investment firm going forward. So that'd be bad because it'd be somewhat anti-competitive and because probably means that individuals then can't get hired. The idea there is that it was probably a quite complicated motion, and the case we ran in theory made sense, but without at least a theoretical example of getting to explain what the thing is, you can never actually get there. So especially for cases that maybe seem intuitive to you or aren't that intuitive to anyone else, it's worth running that kind of thing. The exact opposite of that is Verdun in the semifinals of Sofia Online Open. This is one of my favorite speeches ever. I think it's beautiful. They're opening opposition too. The case that he's trying to prove in the DLO here is also quite complicated. So the motion is this test prefers a world in which sex is seen as special rather than a world in which it is seen as ordinary. So Verdun is defending really normal views of sex. The first thing that Verdun tries to prove in this deputy is that when things are normal, people still see them as special sometimes, even though they're normal. That you can have a special relationship with normal things, even though they're normal and not viewed as special. That sounds really complicated, because it is really complicated. I actually don't even know what that means when first he explained that was what the part of the extension was. And it feels like it kind of breaks the motion almost. Sex can still be special when it needs to be, but it's still normal. And yet somehow he makes it really clearly obvious how it works. Here's the first 30 seconds of the speech.
They can offer me one. If they don't, they'll take one from open economy. So in my speech, in 3, 2, 1, I want to first note how you internalize sex, because note just as OG say, there are just many forms of enjoyment that are seen as ordinary in the status quo, eating, playing tennis, or playing video games. But I think people still develop a unique relationship with these actions. You have foodies, or people think there's something especially emotional about music that they care about in a very different way to others. I think what happens in our side is I think you develop an individual relationship with sex, but you're also far more accepting of other people's individual relationship towards it too. Because comparatively, when you were told that sex is something special, that it's a conjoining of the body, that it's holy to some degree, the harm that occurs for this dissonance and when you don't actually relate to the experience is huge. It's people feeling disconnected from their body when they don't get the crazy sort of enjoyment that Gov says may come, when people don't feel a sense of love and connection with their God or with their partner because procreation is just what they thought it'd be. But it also counts people who really enjoy sex, right? Because if you wish to have sex with multiple people, or you want to have it more frequently than your society permits or tell you should, you feel internally disgusted with yourself. You feel like your desires are something that are out of your control. And the more special it is, the greater level of disconnect you feel from your own desires. You feel more disconnected from your own fucking body because it feels entirely separate from what you think you should be wanting, whereas what is actually wanting. Comparative.
The important point here is that the comparison at the very beginning there is pretty useful. As in, we think that food is normal, and yet some people are foodies, so they have a special relationship with food. That analogy is just one illustration. It isn't actually any new content, but it successfully flips basically all of OG, because then you can say, but if you care about sex being special, you can still have a special relationship with sex. This speech is brilliant. You should watch the whole thing in its entirety at some point. I think it's Wordon's best speech ever. It's one of my favorites. And they go through really cleanly against, I think Claudia, who's now a world CA and OG, and they absolutely smack up Tejas and Max and CG, who are two best players in the world. Quite sick. The point though is that with a little bit of illustration, you can take a good case and make it actually good, as opposed to theoretically maybe good at some point. With that in mind then, I have a chance for us to all do this, which is on the motion that theoretically all of us did. Yeah, I think so. Which is from Iron Maiden's round 3. I don't remember the exact wording, and I didn't find it anywhere in Aura, but I think it was something like this.
You could have asked before.
That would be less fun. Also, pretty close, right?
Well, this Hustle poses motion.
Actually, that makes a big difference. This opposes the increased prevalence of reboots of film and TV adaptations.
Yeah, same vibe. It's fine.
That actually does it. Fair enough. So we'll debate it as that. I think that probably in most rooms, you have to tell me the other one, it's definitely happened in our room. Office always gonna run something like people like reboots because they like the originals. People like a new Harry Potter movie because they like Harry Potter. And that feels like such an obvious and simple claim that it's like, how do you distill that into anything more complex than what it obviously is? But if you just run it like that, as in people like it, then you're always going to be vulnerable to some sort of attack that says, but they don't like it that much, and they might like new content just as much, or they might like rewatching the same thing just as much. So what I'd like everyone to try is taking that simple idea from opposition, that people like reboots because they like the original thing that it's rebooting, people like Harry Potter movies because they like the first Harry Potter movie, and try to disaggregate 3 to 4 mechanisms about why that's specifically true, and then illustrate what those examples actually are. Does people make sense? So take that as a headline and try to figure out individual reasons or warrants, whatever you want to call them, about why that's specifically true. Go. We can do teams of like 2 and 3. So we'll do other of your ideas.
Yeah, so we had some basic mechanisms that I think are probably true. I'll say the ones I said, and then you typed things. I think that a reason why people like reboots because they like the original is because there's a sense of comfort to it, right? It's very accessible in that you know the plot, you know the characters, you know the dynamics, you know that a basic thing is going to happen. We'll get into this in a second. This is why people read things like fan fiction, because it's like familiar to them, but still like something, a new version of it, which means that people will want to engage with that specifically over just engaging with the old thing, because they want to see the new things. They want to see what existing fan culture theoretically can also place onto the new reboots. So like, example of like the Percy Jackson show has some like fan headcanons that are known about by the author that then got like put into the show in certain ways. Freya, you type down.
I think what you would say, we decorated it sort of into people just like familiar things, which I think is the most true and easiest thing. The one way I would label essentially what I said was like people, it takes emotional investment to like engage with new media. You don't have to do that emotional investment if it's the same piece of media. And thirdly, they're like, people want to watch it to see if there's things that they care about these characters have been done. Yeah, fan fiction was the current illustration. We were worrying about necessarily if that's the most applicable to all judges, if they're necessarily
My worry about fan fiction as an example is I think it works in a lot of cases, but my concern as an illustration from what you're saying shouldn't be something you need to explain as being intuitive, right? So, for example, if you have a judge who just on vibe, you're like, they've never been on the website archive of Borrowing in their life. You probably don't want to use that illustration because then you're spending time trying to explain the illustration that doesn't do anything. Yeah. So I'm not sure what the right illustration is, and I think it can be the right illustration, but maybe not for specific judges.
Yeah, sometimes the illustration just be like an actual example of the thing. So like, first of all, that label of people like things that are familiar but different, fire label, exactly the right way to start it out. And then because that's important because it makes it something more resilient too, as in then someone says you want the thing that's most familiar, actually you want something that's like sort of set in that middle ground. So explaining why you definitely need something that's in the middle ground of familiar but different would be important for that specific mechanism under this.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe the example can just be like, people like a sequel to their favorite book instead of just rereading the same favorite book again and again. People like rewatching the third Harry Potter movie after they watched the second instead of rewatching the second Harry Potter movie.
I suppose you could also use the example of Suzanne Collins currently putting out prequels of the Hunger Games novels because you're getting characters that you know but in scenarios you don't necessarily know and you're finding out more about them.
Yeah, that would be the way that I would explain the liking the things that are familiar but different. It's the same characters with the same world but in new situations, so it like scratches a different itch somehow. And then at that point, like, you boil it down to something that's so intuitive, like, obviously we all just don't listen to the same song that we like the most again and again on repeat. We want something slightly different song by the same artist. Like, then it becomes intuitive enough that probably you can just, like, take that off and call it credited.
the song one is possibly is fire as hell. I think the other one we came up with is the idea of like Shakespeare or theatre reboots, because often the same classic plays are done over and over again, and I think that sort of fills the maybe older judge who's never seen AO3 corner of being intuitive.
There are new ways of doing Shakespeare, but it's always going to be the same text.
Great. So if the first headline of what we have here is familiar but different, which is one of our disaggregations, Eli, do you want to give one of your other ones as a version?
So I think the important framing for both of mine, but I'll only give one, is that you often don't make time to rewatch things because it doesn't really feel like it's going to be valuable, and you don't understand what you're going to get out of rewatching things, and unless you're like really desperate and like crying because you just got broken up with. But an event or like a new release means that you get access to these positive things you didn't know you would benefit from. So one of them is like family connections. You like watching The Little Mermaid because your mom used to watch The Little Mermaid with you and would sing along to all of the songs, and you like remembering her sing part of your world. But also whenever this new like version of The Little Mermaid releases, you go and watch it and you know your mom will come along too, and you'll be able to bring your daughter, and so you can continue this family connection, and it feels like it's a good lineage.
Great. And then do you guys have any other thoughts that you were having in terms of other mechanisms or other lines of analysis on this?
I mean,
I have a question on resilience of Ellie's point that I want to ask. I think it's very true, but maybe on an intuitive level, I wonder if there's more you need to do on the rewatching thing, because I think that there's like probably a lot of people who intuitively are like, it's easier for me to rewatch a thing than it is to start to commit to a new thing. So do you then maybe say like, well, you're not starting a new thing, you're starting an old thing that is in a new way.
But you don't get the value. You don't get the value of that. You don't get the value of my point if you rewatch the old thing, because in order to rewatch the old thing and get the value of my point, you have to get your mother to come over and watch this along with you and your daughter, and I think it's actually, like per the framing, quite difficult to get people to do that, and you don't feel the value.
The other thing I would say on this is that with something this granular, it's probably somewhat easy to get like lost in the sauce of imagining the responses to each of the individual mechanisms, and that's always true. Like it wouldn't be a debate if this was just like a provable thing. You could definitely always say, obviously there are going to be responses. So at some point, the point of even disaggregating into multiple different mechanisms is so sure there are some responses for each one, and maybe if there's a common thread of like all of them are premised on not being able to rewatch. We haven't really explained why you can't just rewatch old things. It's the same thing that's useful. But I think it's fine to run things like that, even if you can think of a theoretical response to it, because sometimes it's like you don't get that response. You're like, wow, I spent all that time crossing out these three mechanisms that would have been fine.
Yeah.
It's the Adam Malice problem.
Yeah, exactly. You like overthink every single little response.
I was going to say it's like a really easy mechanism for why you can necessarily get people to watch with your thing. It's just like there's going to be a whole advertisement and schedule release and everything that makes
it's an
people
event.
watch it.
Okay, so we have familiar but different, that you're exploring the characters' world building that you already like in new situations that you're not used to. People like that for the same reason they like listening to new music from their favorite artist or a new book from their favorite author. Then the connections piece of it, that a release of a new thing prompts relationships that you used to have with somebody who originally was there for you, the original, maybe that's a friend or like some family member, and this is now a reason to connect with that person. Might be worth having through. I think there are definitely quite a few other ones you could use here. Thoughts? You want to run the nostalgia one? That's like the first one I thought of.
Yeah. So nostalgia is, I think, the most vulnerable to response of all of them, in that I think that it is the one that's most vulnerable to, but you can just rewatch the new thing. But I think if you've done a reasonable amount of analysis on why people just don't make time to rewatch things because they don't feel like there's going to be value in doing that, then you can run it, which is just like nostalgia. Watching a reboot of an original thing kind of makes you feel like you're a kid again, in that whenever you're listening to I Just Can't Wait to Be King, you remember the way you felt whenever you first heard that song, and the way you felt whenever you were like 7 and like dancing on the couch, singing along to it, and that means that you're able to get the value of it, but you're also, because it is different, able to recognize the value of like the time that has passed in between. So like I think the illustration here would be and you all look a little bit older is my favorite line from Frozen 2, because it acknowledges that there is something different about the new thing that we're watching, but it still recognizes the nostalgia and uses the same tune and uses the same rhythm as some of the original songs.
Yeah. Another one I think to run here is like newness is exciting. It's fun to have something released that you know you like. And sometimes when a new Harry Potter drops, you're excited just about the idea of there being a new Harry Potter because that actual action is something exciting. And the novelty of it is part of why it's exciting to you, regardless of the actual content, you know.
Do you think a mechanism that fits within this is people love and are engaged with the original, which means that they're probably aware to some extent of the flaws of the original. They're wanting to watch the new thing to see what new things that they do to theoretically fix the things they might have not loved about the other thing. So not necessarily the other thing was bad, because I think the other thing is bad, like that's a different argument.
Yeah.
But I love, like, let's say you say like, I love the Harry Potter movies, but I really don't like that they gave all of Ron's lines to Hermione and made Ron seem kind of dumb. Like, I want to see if they're gonna do it in a new way.
Yeah, that'd be good. I think it'd work. I think you also fit that under the first one, as in part of the way that you explore the things with the same characters and new things. You're like, I think they could give. I guess that maybe that's good for the specificity of this motion, what you said. I mean, but maybe it fits into the first where you're like, I like the idea of having the Ron character that I like say more of the things that I like Ron saying, because we listen to the same dialogue that we're using. Yeah. This is all extremely granular. We're spending more time thinking about this than you ever would in prep time or in a debate, which I think is a good thing, because you can just do this like 30% and it's really useful. As in, I actually think it's worth, when you get to a point like this in prep time, spending 30 seconds coming up with 2 or 3 of these. So that the way you run this point is also, people just like things that they like. 3 reasons here. First, because people like things that are familiar but different. There's an exploration of the things that you already like the world building and the characters, in new situations that you hadn't seen them in prior. That scratches a specific itch for us in our brain, like listening to new music from your favorite artist, or listening to a sequel of a book that you like. Second, on connections. The actual release of the new thing and all of the accompanying advertising prompts a realization of all the people that you used to watch the original with. So a new Harry Potter comes out, and you remember that you used to watch the old Harry Potter with your mom or with your best friend, and so therefore you're able to connect with that person in a way you never would have otherwise, because you all agree to go watch it in theaters or read it together, or even just send a text saying, hey, did you hear about the new Little Mermaid? And then thirdly, on nostalgia and newness. That when something is new, there's something nostalgic and exciting about watching that thing for the first time in a new way, where you're not quite sure what's going to happen, but it's still existing in the same world. That it brings up the same feelings from your childhood as it would before when the new version of Harry Potter dropped for the first time and you were excited about it. Therefore, that's like 30 seconds of your speech, but it's worthwhile because then any responses that are given, like, you can just rewatch, or always be slightly jarred, because maybe it applies to 2 of the mechanisms. Even a perfect response might say, totally knock out 2 of those things, but you always have the third one. And then also, when you have those 3 headlines, it's easier for the judge to just mentally check it off as proven and move on to the next thing, which is often sort of binary things that judges think about. That's why massive over-analysis of that kind of thing. Because probably you thought about all of those things when you're doing this, but if you just say it in one continuous line, it's hard to get them all individually credited. Because maybe the response that you get that actually only responded to 2 of those mechanisms, if they aren't disaggregated into 3 mechanisms, will be seen to respond to all of it. And therefore the whole thing will be heavily mitigated, even though it only should be half or something like that. Okay, next is on style, which is I'm describing as sort of the passive thing that you have to do during your speeches in general. I have more thoughts on this too. Okay, these are 3 more arbitrary categories that I have here. The first one is just on confidence in the first place. If you're a white man, this is easy. If you're not a white man, pretend you're a white man. Just always really, really believe the thing you're thinking about. The way I like to think about it sometimes is speak with the vindication of arguing with a friend about something you are 100% positive that you're right about. The feeling that you have there, try to embody it even when you're speaking with something you totally disagree with it. I think Eli's really, really good at this, where Eli gets randomly aside of the motion, and you actually have a suspension of disbelief, where you believe that Eli believes this thing deeply in their core, even if maybe they don't, and you know that they can't possibly, just because the way that they speak is so rooted in that. So just convince yourself that you believe it, and you're much more likely to convince everyone else. Part of this too is really simple, small things. One of my personal stylistic pet peeves is I think if your partner is ever looking at you during your speech, just look down to force them to not be able to look at you. Because if you're always glancing to your partner, it makes you seem less confident in the things you're saying, even if you are really confident in it. That's a really hard thing to control when you're actually giving the speech. So whenever your partner is looking at you for reassurance, it seems right to do the thing of like just nodding at them and being like, yeah, that was good. Actually just like completely ignore them, don't even like make contact with them. So they do that less over time. The other thing under this category is probably like when something goes wrong, own it. As in, there was a moment in the base final last year where Eli like completely lost their paper, and then they made a little quip about how maybe I shouldn't have paper this small, and then eventually got back to the thing they were saying. And so that kind of thing is just helpful because it makes it much more believable that you really do believe you're right. Because if you think that you're kind of wrong, and it seems like you don't totally believe a part of your argument, it also gives the judge more permission to, in the OA, say, well, I think this part was probably a little bullshit. We kind of all know this part was a little bullshit. Whereas if you really believe it, they're forced to dig a little deeper to like really figure out why the thing is wrong. Sometimes you can even just do a little scamming off confidence if nothing else. The next thing I have here is on being engaging, which is also an exercise in pretending if you aren't really feeling like you're engaging. As in, if you don't feel like your speech is going to be engaging, pretend like you're giving a speech that was engaging in order to be more engaging. It's like a fake it till you make it type of philosophy that is really helpful for stylistic things. The theory here is similar to previous things I've said, where judges have long days and judging can be kind of boring. So if you make your judge more interested in what you're saying specifically and they're paying more attention to your speech, that can be good. Sometimes judges even fall asleep during rounds, which happened at like actual Euros, so I don't know if it can happen. So little things like a tiny quip, or really importantly, variation in your tone through your speech. So it's easy to get into like the monotonous debated language. I do this a lot sometimes. But if you can switch up the speed that you're speaking, or the volume that you're speaking, or slowing down, or doing little like fourth wall breaking things, where you're like, wait, this point is actually pretty important, listen to this one, and then going into it, that's really useful because you keep the attention going throughout. The last thing I have here is be real. I'm going to picture of people. This is a few things. Some of it is that debater lingo and like the debatees that we get into can feel really normal, and if you can break up that style of the debating by doing something that feels more genuine, that's useful. So if you can sound like you're talking in a way that is really how you talk, that's advantageous. And then connected to that, if you have a certain stylistic way of speaking in real life or in debating that is good for you, I'd say commit to it, as in don't try to get your style lost in the general sauce of debating, which is whatever the meta thinks is the best stylistic approach at that point. If your style can be specific to you, then you can have certain things that just feel more authentic when they come out of your mouth as opposed to anyone else. The last thing on this part, which I think is maybe even the most advantageous, is try to be different to how everyone else is speaking. So in a round where everyone is being professorial and philosophical and using big long words, if you go exactly the other end of the spectrum and you're like, guys, I think this is kind of stupid, maybe just murder is wrong, and that's the whole case that we're going to run is about how murder is wrong, and you use purposefully really small, simple words throughout the whole speech, and you keep it really direct, and you don't ever go into the same cadence that the rest of the speakers go to, that differentiation is really advantageous for kind of the reasons that the confidence and the engagement were. So if your thing is different from everyone else, that's super helpful. And it also works the other way, where if it feels like everyone is kind of taking the piss, or if everyone is being really surface level in their analysis, as in they're saying, here's 3 mechanisms of why it makes people feel good, and then they give the 3 mechanisms that we gave a few slides ago with our exercise. If you say, it's probably a little more complicated than that, and then you give some more complex analysis, and you're a little bit more disimpassioned, but straightforward with it, that can be helpful. So doing the opposite of what everyone else does is a useful stylistic tool. Does anyone else have any other thoughts on like style that they find particularly effective?
On like, I think that there's an important aspect, and I know this gets into rhetoric as well, but I think that rhetoric and style are really intertwined with each other. Where if you are in a situation where you choose to use a personal story or like deliver something that's like supposed to be personal to you, right? I think that having a style that makes that, regardless of how you really feel about it, makes that seem very real and makes that feel like it's coming from you to a really great extent is probably quite helpful, because I think like there are some debaters who do that. Sometimes there are some debaters who do it quite a lot, which then means if you get used to a debater doing a thing, you need to make sure that like that debater is doing it in a way that's really effective every time. But my bigger thing would be like, don't use the same stylistic choice every time. Don't fall back on one thing. Like try to have a variety so people don't get used to you.
Yeah, that's true. If you always have like strong passion behind your speech, like this is, or like moral righteousness is an example of this, because if moral righteousness always exists in your speech to some extent, it's our subconscious logically knows that you can only be on the morally correct side of the debate as you think of it half the time. So if you're doing 3/4 of your speeches, clearly you aren't actually feeling the moral righteousness that you think you are. Right?
I think often fitting your style to the sort of type of point that you're running is really helpful. So if like the rest of the debate is like very sterile third person view and you're doing a more emotive like single speaker doing, then also matching that and being very emotive in your speech is very useful, because otherwise it kind of feels disingenuous if you're trying to do very like one actor based weighing and you're like sitting there like, well, see, this is why I'm important.
Yeah. I think the other thing to note on all of this is that just practice them, as in have a couple of almost stylistic characters that you can deploy at different parts of the speech, or you can employ in different speeches. Stuff like that's really useful. And so sometimes it's just like, I tend to speak in this way. Or like for me, it's like the type of speech that I give sitting down and the type of speech that I give standing up are in my mind two literally different types of speeches. Where I have like the sitting down ones be the ones where I'm trying to be more like professorial and be more like thoughtful and slow and guided. And then the ones that I'm sitting up try to be like slightly more passionate and direct and stuff like that. So, I don't know, that's helpful for me because it gives like a physical indication of differentiation. But trying to do things you haven't done before is useful because then your stylistic arsenal grows in that way. You were going to say something.
Yeah. I think the contrasting thing to the rest of the round is really, really important, because I think that oftentimes the most effective speeches are the ones where everyone else has been passionate, and then you're like, all right, guys, gut check, let's be serious about this debate. Or alternatively, when everyone else has been very technical and precise, and you're like, this debate is actually about real people, or like that, those kinds of things. So I think just keeping an idea on not just the pulse of the round though, but also what's working and not working for judges and what judges are getting tired of is really helpful. I spend most of my speeches just staring at the judges because it's really good to see how they're reacting and how they're responding and what they like.
Yeah, that last point is a really important one to note. As in, have a little bit of idea, especially in like the Scottish circuit specifically. You probably are starting to know what judges like. There's nothing shameful about using that to your advantage. Like if you know that somebody's the kind of judge where like they roll their eyes a little bit when you say something a little too rhetorical, like just cut it, just make it fit the style that you know that they like better. Being aware of that true is good.
Yeah.
Also when you're giving a speech, like looking at the judge, because often they give such obvious visual indications, unless it's like Alicia or Adam who are really difficult to read.
I think additionally, and this is my perspective on Shakespearean tragedies as well, almost every speech needs a level of levity, I think. Because this is not all the time, right? There are gonna be speeches where the whole thing's just really somber and that's just what's happening. But I think that there are times when I'm judging where the thing happens of we're getting very in the passion, we're all very heartfelt, whatever, and then I have a feeling of it's round 3 on an econ round, and I know you don't care. A, I know you don't care about this. B, we're playing a game. I think not an acknowledgement, not confident, but a level of levity of acknowledging to some extent that it's a debate can be helpful in some cases, because I think that there's a bell curve of the passion's really great, but sometimes the passion gets to be too much and you're like, what, why is this happening? And so it's good to balance it.
Yeah, that's true. Sometimes speakers, especially in whips and stuff like that, I think can really do an effective balance of matching their analysis to also do that, or some of the analysis is really real world grounded and explaining how this specific thing that ties to the emotion is affected in XYZ way. Mm-hmm. And the next bit of analysis is on a more meta level, here are my actual articles of weighing on this point, which is and here are the very debate type of things. That kind of variation is good too, because you're look, I'm going to do it the stylistic way, and then I'll also give you the structural reasons. Like,
Yeah.
speakers, really good speakers often do this, where they're like, they'll explain what they're trying to say, and they'll be like,
Yeah.
to make you credit it, here are the 3 structural reasons that this is true. Like, Jack Williams is
Like, this is an example of a speech that I gave, right? But I think it was actually incredibly important was the Durham final when I had to rebut the CG case. Because my rebuttal to the CG case was unfortunately somewhat flippant of these people probably matter, but there aren't very many of them and you didn't tell us why. Which like, did personally feel weird to say, but I specifically made sure to deliver it in a way that was like, I get that the thing I'm saying sounds a little callous, but let's just like be real about it here. Because I think that there's a point, like I think you have to walk a line sometimes delivery-wise.
Yeah, I think that's true. I had my plan for, I don't know, what time is it? Yeah, screw it, we'll do it. Like it. My plan here is we're going to split up into groups based on your belief on something. Where do you guys live? Literally in Edinburgh.
Marshman.
Like near Newington, Evans Cross.
Would you rather live in Marshman or on the other side of like Princes Street, other side of Waverley?
Marshman.
Marshman.
Freya, you're gonna be on Mackenzie's team. You're gonna go on that side.
Just
Okay, you're gonna split. You two are gonna go on that side, and I'll join you guys.
okay.
Basically, you're gonna spend 5 minutes thinking about why it's better to live in Marshman as opposed to, or I wouldn't just say living in Old Town and beyond, as opposed to living in New Town and beyond as a student in Edinburgh. We're gonna spend about.
That's cool.
The idea is you have to be really passionate
It's on my
about the
sticky note.
thing that you don't believe,
Okay.
and make it. I'm not gonna.
You're making Freya. It's interesting.
Yeah, I know. Freya, this is what I think Mackenzie to do it. Mackenzie said no. This is a
I think Mackenzie should just do it.
Freya's like.
Freya got assigned to this team. Freya
I
agrees
think
with
you
us.
maybe, no, actually, because the reason that we had you do it is because you wrote it down. Now you haven't written it down, so we should have Mackenzie do it. Bad excuse. Anyway,
Don't adjust my laptop because it will break.
the point here isn't to give like the best technical argument, but make me believe the most that Eli genuinely prefers Newtown and you genuinely prefer Old Town. Eli, you can start us off. You can have 30 seconds when you feel like it.
Okay. 30 seconds. Thank you, Nora.
5 seconds.
Because my phone is currently recording the workshop.
Yeah, you're fine. Here.
Okay. First, I think that it's substantially more convenient because I think that you live closer to Waverley, which is where you're likely to travel in and out of. So if you do any degree of travel, honestly, it's a pain to walk half an hour all the way to Waverley or half an hour to Haymarket. They're both equally far, and it's reasonably pretty far. Also, I think that it's just prettier. Like, I think that you have the gardens, you have all of these really gorgeous places that you can walk and explore. I also think it's less studenty, which is good because it means that it's cheaper. It means you have nicer stuff because they're not trying to appeal to students, they're trying to appeal to real people, and this is good.
Fire, have a seat. Mackenzie, shoot.
How long do I have to speak for?
Yeah, as long as you feel like it. 30 seconds. So.
I'll send myself. Okay. I think it's just true that when you live in Marchmont, you are much closer to both campuses, so it appeals to more students. Because I think when you go to King's, like if you live in Newtown, it's both an hour like bus, which is an absolute trek when you have 9 AM lots to get to, and it's actually really quite annoying. So I just think it's inconvenient when you could just do a 20-minute walk instead. This also applies to just being at main campus, especially for things like debate. If you want to go to like a debate social at 9 at night, this in Cowgate, it's much easier to just take the 5-minute walk than it is to like get 2 buses to try and like get to where dance flat because it's an absolute nightmare or whatever. It's easier just not to miss juniors, which I think is really important for a lot of debaters. Just because, what else? The clubs in Cowgate.
Your passion's from the day long.
I don't like clubs as well. And then also there's more.
You have like 17 reasons. I thought you only had 30 seconds.
Well, not a minute. So, I'm so passionate I lost track of time.
I would have said more things if I'd known I had more time.
I'll stop.
Oh, okay.
I don't want to, but Forced
So
to
I
passionate.
particularly enjoyed the passion of, oh, look, there's more.
The buttons don't work all that fast.
Yeah, buttons work
We
always.
may have minimized some stuff.
That's okay, it doesn't matter.
So far.
It's also a touch
I
screen.
actually
So
felt really passionate about the 9 a.m. loss.
As you were saying it, I realized how many times you must do this.
I feel like the delivery of juniors. It's
yeah. So my personal favorite that we didn't get a chance to say is also in the meadows. You're closer to campus, so you're substantially less likely to miss round one of juniors.
Oh, wow.
especially it means that you get to sleep longer and not miss games.
I don't think that would meaningfully influence whether I this round will.
No, I just want a bucket of coffee.
Because you have
Oh,
done
no,
it
sorry,
both
whether
years.
someone theoretically would.
Right, of course.
Last thing is on rhetoric, and then we're gonna do emotion rhetoric. This is what I'm categorizing as like the actual active stuff. The times you aren't just like passively delivering it in your speech, but the times where someone's like, that was a really rhetorical speech, or I like that rhetorical thing that they're doing. I do think debaters put rhetoric in a category that is separate to other stuff in a way that's sometimes kind of weird, as in what we consider rhetorical speeches is actually a really narrow tunnel vision view of what rhetoric is, which is that we think it's like the flowery language or the personal anecdotes or the weird Latin quotes, when that's probably only one type of rhetoric, and there's lots of other things that are also specifically rhetorical tools. So when I talk about rhetorical tools then, I mean it's stuff in delivery that is trying to influence your persuasion specifically through the delivery that you're using as opposed to the content of what you're saying. Here are some examples that are beyond what you maybe normally think of. Okay, some of these are obvious, like the introductions is probably helpful for framing the speech. So if you're going to do something, like my best Latin quote intros are the ones where there's some sort of clear utility of the thing. So, for instance, around the Euros, where I talked about, I forget exactly what the quote was, Veritas ante omnia, which is truth before all, which is a quote I used in a round about journalism, about journalistic integrity and how much it matters. If I'm going to do that, it's a helpful frame, because then when I'm specifically proving why that matters, I can label it the same Latin that I used to start the speech. So there's helpful connectivity there. Or like the one time that I got credited as like a solvency about why even immoral, guilty pleasures should still count as pleasure, and my only real proof, because I kind of forgot about it, was like one Latin quote about that. That's kind of useful then, because it's like actually framing the speech as it works out. One useful one that is variable, but can work well on certain judges. These particularly are good if you're trying to convince the least experienced panelist, which is a specialty of mine. The quote is sometimes helpful. If you can actually write down what someone says, because you think it'll be useful later in the round, it's helpful then to say, actually, the PM said, and I quote word for word, and then give the quote they're using. Because if you're using that to then respond to, say, the member of government, that's really helpful. Because you can say, like, look, bro, your opening said exactly this. And even if maybe the judge maybe would or wouldn't have bought that in a vacuum, if they can remember them saying exactly that quote, because the quote is actually accurate, they're more likely to believe that it is a knife, or that it is contradictory, or that maybe it's actually unconvincing, or whatever else they're trying to say, because you can actually point to exactly the thing they said, as opposed to something else. So using a quote, a funny voice included if you want to. This person, yeah, go
What
for
are your thoughts on using quotation marks with your hands in speeches?
I think kind of brilliant. If it works, it works. That's an example. That'd be the same thing. Sometimes the rhetoric you're using is the anti-rhetoric. I think Adam and Nora at Durham, this is actually Adam's beginning of his speech at Durham, I think is a really powerful rhetorical tool for its lack of rhetoric. As in, specifically the approach that Adam used was, it was a motion, I don't know how many of you were at Durham, it was about whether you should pin the poppy to your chest on Memorial Day, whatever it was called in this country. And Adam starts the speech was, I cannot possibly compete with top half and their beautiful rhetorical language. What I can compete with is BP debating part of this thing. And what he's saying there is basically implying that his speech will be completely devoid of rhetoric, that he's like a talentless, artless fool. And by being so extreme in that way, it's a really beautiful rhetorical way to start your speech, because it lends credence to everyone else, it sort of puts yourself down, and it puts yourself in a position to end up winning the round pretty conclusively, at least in the eyes of the panel. So that's really helpful because you're being anti-rhetorical as your rhetorical tool, which becomes kind of paradoxical, but it's useful to do. Sometimes you can do the opposite version of that, where you're like, look, I'm not as smart as all of these other people are here, but at least I know about this specific thing, or I think they've overcomplicated this kind of thing, and so I can be simple in this way. Which connects to another one of these, which is simplicity. If you use like really, really simple language, to hammer something home, I think that's useful. And I don't know, you guys can probably think of lots of other examples of this kind of stuff. Lying is a useful one if you can get away with it, though you have to be careful about that kind of stuff. But sometimes you can make up a fact and just like really push it, and if you sound convincing enough, it can be a helpful rhetorical thing. And then lastly, humor. It's kind of like the levity thing that Dora was talking about earlier, where if you just break up your speech by using a joke, it can be helpful to push it through. Other rhetorical tools that people have in mind.
Can I ask a question, actually?
Please.
The trouble that I find, specifically when using like an intro that's like a nice intro, is that the transition from the nice intro to the debate and like the giving the nice speech feels really jagged. How do you recommend like moving from flowery example of thing to, and here's why you're wrong, and here's why you're wrong, and here's why you're wrong?
Yeah, I think sometimes you just need to think about what that connection is going to be. So you have the flowery intro where you give some example about the thing, and you're like, and it is on situations like this that opposition gets it wrong. Here's the material that I disagree with when you go into it. Or, and this is the piece of the debate that nobody's addressed and actually is what the motion is about. Here's the extension of the closing. Something like that. Sometimes too, if you make it really abrupt, that's almost as rhetorically powerful. As you have a speech that's eloquent and like you have some cool quote in it, and then you say, the extension from closing government is blank.
So
Period, you start the extension.
So this is also interesting because you're talking mostly about what you can do in a first speech. Say you're like,
The first one was supposed to be an example from a second speech, but I don't
but like a whip speaker, right? Like,
Yeah.
I find, what is the best way to, if you want to use rhetoric in your speech, make your rebuttal, like, it often feels to me, I don't know if other people feel this way, that when I'm rebutting people and I'm just being like, and analytically you're wrong for this reason, this reason, and this reason, it then feels like it's very difficult to combine those two things. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I would. One way to do it that I've seen be successful in the past is to start with the rhetorical, if flippant response, and then go into the actual realism, and then you can almost acknowledge that the rhetorical thing isn't enough. So you say like, opening government is trying to convince you that the reason that women don't get paid as much as they should get paid is because women don't know that the gender wage gap exists. Of course women know, the problem is more ingrained than that. And then you give the reason, you're like, obviously that's a flippant understanding of opening government's case, but, and then you give the reason that you're actually giving the responses or whatever else. So something that's useful, but yeah, it's something that is a good question. People find it curious to do it. Does anyone else have any other like particular rhetorical things that they think are cool, that they've heard in speeches that were kind of like that one?
I love Amitai's Donald Trump impression speeches. It's fucking hilarious. It's Amitai and Ayal, they do it together. But it round 8 of Euros, the way that they made it through that round was Ayal just made Donald Trump impressions for about 2 minutes at the top of his speech, and the case was just Donald Trump is crazy, but it was an illustrative device to prove that he was crazy. So it was, the speech is like, he's eating the dogs, he's eating the cats.
Yeah, no, I quite like that too. I like things like that go through the speech, because I feel like a lot of times the rhetoric of it often starts and ends. It's like intro, speech, conclusion, and then the intro and the conclusion are like rhetoric.
Yeah.
But I like it if you can have something that like loops back around every time, like a recurring theme almost. I think that's nice. It's very hard to do, but I liked it when I've been able to hear it.
Yeah, it's true. That's because you can point to like the bit of the intro that the thing connects to or whatever else. Having a through line of your speech is good too, for like the earlier reasons I was talking about with engagement, and then you know what's coming to. So sometimes the rhetoric, especially if you use it at the beginning, can be like a structural tool where you're like, I don't know, one of the ways, this is a silly way, one of the ways I like doing it, I have one Latin quote that I like. It's like amor et mele et fele, which is like love, honey, and venom. And then you'll explain which bits are the honey and which bits are the venom. That's like a structural tool. So cool. Stuff like that.
I did have one question, because a lot of rhetoric is also delivery, right? So you do need some level of like, you can use all the rhetorical devices you want, but if you don't deliver them in a specific way, they're not going to work. But I do find that sometimes rhetoric comes across very differently from different speakers.
Yeah.
Like I think that saying the quote thing, I think could come across very differently if done even like slightly differently or by slightly the wrong person, like if you come across mean-spirited as opposed to like part of the debate and stuff like that, like do you have specific ways of avoiding that?
Yeah, good question. Maybe an overall answer is the authentic ones that feel more like you'll both be better at and will sound better because they feel like they fit your vibe more, whatever that unspeakingly means. The other thing is to overcompensate. So when you use the quote thing to make fun of someone, to be like, okay, obviously this isn't at all what they said, and I'm strawmanning them a bit here, but I do think that they are missing XYZ. Yeah, that's a good question. Does anyone else have anything else on this or any other questions? Otherwise we can get to an emotion prep. Brilliant. Okay. Should we do... You want to start us off?
Sure. Answer to the clarification, it doesn't matter if Theseus is still alive. Men tend not to live as long as boats, so I think reasonably Theseus is alive for part of the ship's lifetime and probably dies during the ship's lifetime. I also want to note that the motion says that Theseus had a ship, but the motion also says that the ship is still the ship of Theseus, therefore implying that the ship is around longer than Theseus is around. Great. I think that identity is based on how something is perceived and how people engage with that thing if this thing cannot give themselves an identity directly. This is going to be an argument mostly of just examples and illustrations. I think that a woman who changes her last name after marriage is still inherently herself despite a superficial change. I think that I am still me regardless of the fact that all of my cells over the course of my life have died and that I don't remember being a baby. I think that most of us probably agree that I still have a sense of identity and I am still myself regardless of this. But I know that these are humans and that I give myself identity, so I think then what I say is, it's about the way we interact with people. You all still interact with me as me, regardless of the fact that I, physically change. I still call the Harrah's Center in Asheville the Civic Center because that's how I grew up with it being, and that's what I believe that it is, regardless of how it superficially changes. So I think the first argument is that as long as it is called the ship of Theseus, it is inherently still the ship of Theseus because that is what people believe. I also think that realistically, the ship's planks being replaced gradually means that it is still the ship of Theseus, but I also think that on a wider scale, anything that is named the ship of Theseus is the ship of Theseus, i.e. I think even if we destroyed the ship and then rebuilt it, it would probably still be the ship of Theseus. I also think that care about a thing increases its longevity. I think that we don't think that someone who has had their leg amputated and replaced is less of themselves. I think what it means is that something is even more of itself when someone cares about it and someone cares about maintaining that thing rather than creating a new version of it, i.e. it is still the ship of Theseus because they're taking the care to replace each plank one at a time rather than just building a new ship and calling it something else. That's the Boji case.
Fire. The OO case is as follows. There are two parts of it. First, that conception isn't reality, that perception is less important than the physical stuff. The idea here is that we don't think that conception of things is equal to the reality of those things. So if I replaced Nora with a clone of Nora, and we all believed that it was a clone, it was Nora, we didn't notice that it was a clone, it still wouldn't be Nora. So the idea here is that perception matters, but it is less important than the actual reality of the thing, so physicality should triumph over perception. With that in mind, we think that different physical things are different, and that this counts as that for three broad reasons. The first being that generally when things have the same cosmetic features, but different parts of those things, we think of them as different. So if the exact same DNA of humans is shared across someone and their clone, we think of those as different humans, even if the cosmetic features, their personality, all of those things remain exactly the same, because we recognize that those are actually the same kind of thing. This is equivalent to that, because sure, the ship might be exactly the same in name and in perception, and in even the logs themselves, but because it's a physically different thing, it has to be different. And for the same reason that we think that sequels are different than the original movie. If we replaced all of the scenes in a movie one by one, eventually the movie would be different. When that happens would be unclear, but it actually doesn't matter, because eventually it would happen that way. The second part of it is that parts define the whole by definition. A new outfit is defined as a new outfit when it becomes a new outfit. What this means here is that I can change my socks, and that might not change it, and maybe even changing the pants might not change the outfit. But when I change the pants, and the shirt, and the socks, and everything else, at some point it has to have been a different thing. So we define the parts by the whole. The last thing is a comment on speed, that the speed of the changes is irrelevant, and we can show this to be true, that even though they're replaced individually, that's no functionally different than they were replaced all at once. If you imagine a heap, we could replace each sand, a grain of sand in the heap, and take them out one by one. And each time we take a physical grain of sand, it would still be a heap. But we still understand as humans that eventually that heap would cease to exist, because all of the sand would go away. It probably wouldn't be the very last time we take a grain of sand away. We wouldn't know when the heap ceased to be a heap, but clearly at some point it isn't a heap any longer. What that indicates is that the actual speed at which you take a grain of sand away doesn't change whether the actual heap itself is still defined as a heap. And so therefore, this shouldn't count either. The heap's not a heap, the ship's not a ship. It's just a different ship. That's O's case. What does CG say?
So we considered sort of the standard thing, possibly an extension, stories maybe, that's boring. Stand up, be like, none of this wishy-washy nonsense. It has to be the same boat because maritime law requires it to be the same boat for legal and organizational purposes.
Hell yeah.
Running things essentially along the lines of like A is just like illegal. You get logistical problems. You start duplicating the boat. You know the whole point of Theseus's concept is that you make a second boat out of the old pieces, which is like A. At that point, you're just duplicating the boat. That's illegal. You can have copies of boats. It's harder to track where people are. It's harder to track crimes. Also, the problem is if you're making the second ship out of all of this old wood, that shit's going to be rotting. It's going to be damaged. It's going to be a horrible quality ship. It's going to be a danger to its owners. It's going to be a danger to other people on the water. That's just terrible for the maritime quality of life for people sailing for safety on the water. Well, essentially go further and impact this more. But that's the case. Run the rhetoric on like the difference to everyone else's case, and weigh it on practical impacts over philosophical nonsense.
If closing opposition MO comes up and is like, we agree with all this, but we think that the law doesn't define society because the state's kind of bad at that sometimes, what would you say?
I think I just push back on the concept that like law kind of does heavily influence society. Like even if the state's bad, the law does objectively like define and affect society. So it is still relevant.
Seems good enough to me. Go for it, Ruby.
No,
POI.
I was gonna add to that response and be like, also guys, it's like a ship. So there's some states where even if there's like a terrible person in power, they're gonna still want to make kind of good laws on certain things. You could just say that ships are one of these things.
Like it. What would CO say?
We think, so to put us in the context of closing government, we think that laws only exist insofar as they're utile to people. So we think that we agree with closing government that the metric of the debate is utility, we just disagree with the way to actually get this utility. We think that it being the same ship is not actually, or it being the same ship is not actually that valuable to the law, or is it going to cause so many problems? So the case is that we make delineation between like cultures and schools of thought because it's useful for concepts. This is also why we make delineation between languages. The only reason that Croatian is not exactly the same language as Slovakian is because it's like a political and cultural standpoint more than an actual technical standpoint. There are differences, right? And yet at the same time, according to some people, Scots is the same language as English, and this is also just like it's a cultural standpoint. So it's only whenever we think that it is practically useful that we think it's important to make a distinction and a differentiation. We just think that at this point it's practically useful to make a distinction and a differentiation between the original ship and this ship for a few things. The first one is we think it's a more precise label. We think that whenever someone is no longer a baby, they are now an adult, and it's important to make this distinction because there's a difference between a baby and an adult. And although both of them are still technically still kind of human, they're still in the same vein, both of them are still ships. We think that it's important to make a distinction and a differentiation in order for language to be an accurate descriptor of what is happening in the real world. We think that to describe it as the ship of Theseus is not a true reflection of all the nuances of its experience. We also just think it causes practical problems. Perhaps the ship that Theseus originally was on would always get a leak in the right front of the ship, and now that every single board has been replaced, that doesn't happen anymore. So there are practical considerations involved in making a linguistic distinction.
What would?
I think I would stand up in response to this and be like, we have a practical descriptor for the difference, it's called the age of the ship.
It still doesn't account for the things like historical problems, right? It doesn't account for, we have a board that always used to leak that now doesn't leak, and so we're spending time and resources on tarring that particular section over and over, even though that isn't actually a problem anymore and hasn't been for 20 years.
If you get some sort of response along the lines of, sometimes it would be good if things were true, but the things still aren't true, how would you engage with that idea? But the practical is separate to that.
illustration, because I don't think I get that response, and I would just be like, that's fucking unintuitive.
It would be good if there was no homophobia in the world, but homophobia still exists. It might be good if this was considered a separate ship, but that doesn't mean that it is a separate ship.
Ruby, do you have thoughts? I'll think.
I think that kind of misses the argument in some regards. So basically, I think our argument is that you just have more tools to be able to point out specific nuances within homophobia and how that plays out. So the way that this POI would probably interact is that this is probably a good response, but everyone in this room is debating in the real world. The thing that changes is how you're able to engage with concepts like homophobia and how you're able to label specific things as microaggressions.
I think there's a secondary layer here, which is also maybe homophobia doesn't exist. Maybe you're actually just wrong, because it is in fact a perceptual thing.
Yeah.
I think there's a problem in the debate that I am curious about how different teams would deal with it. Of at what point do we think that the ship is no longer the ship? Is it when the first plank is replaced, or is it when the entire ship is replaced? Because I think that there are arguments that work with both, but I think that you probably need to address either one on either side, right? Like I need to be like, I think you're still the same, regardless of how many changes are made, but like whatever. But I think that you need to address it in the debate because is the ship still the ship at what point, basically?
Yeah, that's why I also envisioned that being a clash, which is why I had a really long bit about heaps of sand that ended up being irrelevant. But we'll be good against that response specifically.
Yeah, I think the delineation thing works actually pretty well in terms of that clash, because basically we delineate things all the time and we just do this gradually. So modernism and postmodernism, there's not an exact date where you go, everything after this date means that it has to be that. No, you probably do it on a sliding scale, the same way you do like, a baby is probably still a baby conceptually to people for quite a while before it becomes a child, but it still becomes a child.
Yeah, seems clever. Are we ready to move on to the motion?